First, how many people say that Alexander the Great was a Greek? Raise your hand. How many say that he was Greek? How many people say no, he wasn't? And how many don't know? Well, actually, he came from Macedonia. And Macedonia is like coming from the Hicks for the Greeks. But the historians come down on the side that Macedonia can claim to be part of Greece, and therefore Alexander can hold on to his Greek heritage. Point number one. Point number two. Who was the main teacher of Alexander the Great? His father, Philip, wanted to have the finest teachers in Greece to teach his son, Aristotle. And did you know that Alexander the Great loved to read books? And the final gift that he was given by Aristotle was a copy of Homer. And he carried that copy of Homer with him throughout his battles. Point two. Point three. There was a horse that Philip had. A wild horse. Big, beautiful wild horse, but the horse would not let anybody ride on it. And so Philip was going to put the horse down. Anyway, this 12-year-old kid says, hey, let me try to see what I can do. And that 12-year-old kid took that horse and tamed him. Who was the 12-year-old? Alexander. The horse was Bucephalus. That horse was with Alexander on all of his battles. And if you remember, it was kind of hard to be poor Bucephalus because you see, Alexander, like Rommel, was always riding right into the battle. And so who was there in front of him? The poor horse. But anyway, the horse would only let one person ride him, and that was Alexander. Later on, poor Bucephalus died in one of the last battles that Alexander fought, and so Alexander, in tribute to Bucephalus, founded a city, and it's named after the horse. Okay, point three. Point four. In 338 BC, 338, the Greek city-states were opposed to Philip expanding. Philip II from Macedonia wanted to come down and really take over Greece. And so he came down, and there was a famous battle in 338 at Chaeronea. And at that battle, Philip II led the right wing of the Macedonian forces. There was an 18-year-old kid that was in charge of the left wing. Who was that? Oh, of course. Okay. Point number five. One of the problems with Philip II is he liked women, and not just to admire them from afar. And so there came a point after 338 when Philip wanted another wife. Of course, he had a first wife who was quite a woman, Olympia. So there's the wedding ceremony, there's Olympia sitting there, and of course there's Philip with his new wife. And somehow Philip, gets into an argument with his son. And there's a fight. And the father is charging at his son, holding out a sword to stab the son. One the father was so drunk that he fell over, going from one chair to another. And his son went over to him on the floor and said, hey, Dad, you want to lead people across the Hellespont to Persia, you can't even go from one chair to another. Well, Dad didn't like that, and poor Philip and his mother, Olympia, went off for a period in exile. But eventually, Alexander came back. And in 336, that's the fifth point, poor Philip was assassinated. Now, there's really a question of whether Alexander was involved with that, because you see, Alexander, he's a mama's boy. And the point was that maybe he didn't like what Dad was doing with these other ladies, especially marrying them. But the historians have come down on the side saying, no, Alexander really didn't do it his father. But after the father died, the son had to fight off all these others that wanted to get independent again from Philip. And he did. And he not only conquered all of Greece, but he decided, I'm going to carry out Dad's dream. And so he took 50,000 of his best friends, great soldiers, and they headed off across the Hellespont and went into Asia. Point number 6. Did Alexander ever lose a battle? No. He never lost a single battle. Now there were battles at Phoenicius, battle at Issus, and the big one was at Gaugamela. And you see the movie, Oliver Stone. Oliver Stone, he's all these fiction movies and people think they're factual. But Oliver Stone, has this movie, and at Gaugamela, supposedly, the Greeks attack, and who's in front? Alexander, and he rides right up to Darius, into the middle of where Darius is, and then Darius then heads off and deserts his army, and the army falls apart, and that's how Alexander won. Well, they think that's not so true anymore. They think that the army of Darius actually deserted Darius. They had become spooked by what they saw in the sky, all these strange signs and everything, the moon, the sun, etc. And so they deserted poor and he's left there alone, and so he decides, well, maybe I better leave. When he leaves behind his wife and kids, and all the women of the court. Now, doesn't sound too heroic, but Alexander greets them all, takes them into his tents, treats them very well, and he's trying to figure out what to do about Darius. But anyway, poor Darius eventually gets assassinated. And who was angry about Darius getting assassinated? Why, Alexander. How dare you assassinate the King of Kings? And so the legend was created by Alexander that Darius wanted him to be the next king, taking over from good old Darius. All right, point number 6. Point 7. How many of you heard of the Gordian knot? Okay, all of you have. Now here is what we learned about the Gordian knot. Supposedly there was this knot. It was a huge rope kind of thing that had no ends, and it was tying up this chariot. And the idea is that you had to untie the Gordian knot, or unloose the Gordian knot, and whoever did, the prophecy was they would become the head and king of Asia. So up comes Alexander, tries his luck, he can't find the ends of the knot, and the story is that Alexander did what? Took out his sword and chopped the knot. Now that turns out not to be so true. The other story is that when Alexander came up there, he looked at the knot and he saw that it tied up the axle of the wheel of the chariot there in the temple. The idea was this chariot was dedicated to Zeus. And then he figured out, if I unloose the axle of the wheels and slip that out, the knot will fall apart. That's story number 2. But story number 3 is that everybody there was angry at Alexander, no matter how he untied the knot. Because this was the tourist attraction. And for 200 years, people would come there. And there would be the challenge. And everybody would pay their money and stay at the 4-star hotels there. And so Alexander ruined their tourist trade. Okay. Point number 7. Point number 8. Point number 8 is that eventually Alexander's 50,000 friends, by now diminished, had gone through enough battles. They were tired. And they decided that when Alexander wanted to go further into India, by the way, he got all the way through Kabul. Where's Kabul? Iskander? The pass there, what's the name of the famous pass? Alexander actually went in all those places. I really think Obama should have consulted Alexander or something. So anyway, Alexander wanted to go further into India, and his troops said, no, we've had enough, we're finished. And of course, they only had contracts then for, 3 months or whatever. The troops all decided they wanted to go home, and Alexander was forced to go back. And the end then for poor Alexander comes when he gets to Iraq, and he gets to Babylon, which is somewhere near our city of Baghdad. He gets there, and he goes on a bender. I mean, Alexander could drink. He didn't seem to really love women that much. That's another story. But he drank, and he drank, and he drank, and he drank, and the idea is that for 12 days he came down with fever and eventually passed away. Now, there's also a story about did they do in Alexander, but it seems like they probably did not. And when they buried poor Alexander, they buried him in what? In his casket. It was filled with honey. And they put Alexander's body in the honey. Now, I haven't figured out why. I guess when you die, you want something sweet, is that it? Or the smell? Or maybe amber or something. Okay, point number 8. We're getting to the last 2 points. Point 9. When Alexander died, and he's dying, and they come over and they say to Alexander, who do you want to succeed you and take over your empire? And what does Alexander say? He says it goes to the strongest. And that's what led to all the disputes and troubles after, and all these kings getting killed. And eventually his 4 generals split up his entire empire. And that's where later on we get the Ptolemies and Cleopatra, we get the Seleucids, etc. So, poor Alexander did leave a will. Now, as an attorney, you know how I like that. I mean, I don't know what he paid an hour for the will, but he did leave a will. At least the story is he did. And in the will, what he asked for was, number 1, he wanted to build a monument to his dad, Philip. Remember the old philanderer? He wanted to build him a pyramid that was taller than the Egyptian pyramids. Well, they didn't get around to that. Then he wanted to build a whole bunch of temples. Didn't get around to that. He wanted to send his troops to conquer Arabia and the Mediterranean and go after Rome. Didn't get around to that. He did want, however, to create a new kind of society, a new kind of bringing together the East and the West. And you remember that at one scene there where he had decided not to go further into India, they had a huge party, 9,000 guests, and all 9,000 showed up. And the idea was there that all of the Macedonians would do what with the Persian ladies? Marry them. And this would create a new people. So anyway, my understanding is they did do the marriages, something like 10,000 of them, and all the children and all that, but the marriages didn't last that long. Too many attorneys, I guess, divorces. But the point was that in his will, Alexander recommended that all these peoples ought to be moved from like Greece and Macedonia over to Asia, and all the women ought to be moved over to Macedonia and Greece, and they would intermarry, and this would create a new society. And that's where we get to the final point. What is the main idea that we get from all that Alexander did? What is the main kind of award, or what was the outcome? It's the Hellenistic civilization. Bringing together the East and the West, the best from both. Bringing together Greek art, bringing together all the Asians and Persians have done. And so that Hellenistic culture, and we can have another lecture on that, lasted another 300 years. And so Alexander did finally do something great. Okay, thank you very much.